Assalamu alaikum. This is Hena Zuberi, and you're watching Muslim Network News. Our top story tonight is about President Biden's first address to a joint session of Congress. America may well be on its way to creating a safety net for families. In his first address to a joint session of Congress yesterday, US President Joe Biden announced a proposal to broadly expand federal government assistance for American families and children. The $118 trillion America's Families Plan features 2 years of government paid pre kindergarten education for children and 2 years of free community college for young adults. The program also calls for $225 billion in childcare assistance for families, as well as monthly payments of at least $250 to parents. Biden said the programs will be paid for with tax increases on the wealthy and corporations. Republicans are already attacking the plan as too costly. They've also decried the suggestion of raising taxes on corporations and the wealthiest of Americans. Biden also lauded the progress in COVID vaccines but urged more Americans to get vaccinated, noting that the age of eligibility has been lowered to 16 and up. We're going to discuss the healthcare aspect of the America's Family Plan later in our show tonight, so keep watching Muslim Network News. 3 Georgia men were indicted and charged with hate crimes and attempted kidnapping of Ahmaud Arbery. A federal grand jury in Southern District of Georgia charged Travis McMichael, his father Gregory McMichael, and William Bryan with 1 count of interference with the rights and 1 count of attempted kidnapping. The McMichaels were also charged with using, carrying, and brandishing, and in Travis's case, discharging a firearm during in relations to a crime of violence. All 3 defendants have been charged in a separate state proceeding with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and criminal attempt to commit a felony. No trial date has been set for the state's case. Ahmaud Arbery was a 25-year-old black man who was jogging minutes away from his house in Brunswick, Georgia, when the McMichaels, who were both white, allegedly killed him. Bryan, who's also white, filmed parts of the killing. U.S. federal agents seized electronic devices yesterday at the New York home and office of Rudy Giuliani. They were executing a search warrant in relation to his activities relating to the Ukraine. Giuliani is the former mayor of New York and former President Donald Trump's personal attorney. The investigation is seeking information about Giuliani's role in relation to activities in Ukraine connected to Trump's 2020 re-election campaign last November. U.S. prosecutors in New York want to know whether Giuliani acted illegally as an unregistered foreign agent by seeking to influence U.S. policies towards Ukraine. Giuliani sought information in Ukraine that might have been damaging to Biden in his presidential campaign. It related to payments made to his son for his work on the board of a Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma. This was when the elder Biden oversaw U.S. policy on Ukraine as vice president under former President Barack Obama. Investigators are also looking at the role Giuliani played in Trump's eventual firing of former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Maria Yovanovitch. She testified about her experiences during Trump's administration's first impeachment case in the House of Representatives. Pfizer, Moderna, and now Novavax, a new COVID vaccine from a small American pharmaceutical company, is in the works. Novavax has pledged to produce 150 million doses a month by the second half of the year. The promise comes after it received $1.6 billion for development and manufacturing. Novavax is also one of the few manufacturers pledging significant deliveries of the vaccine worldwide. This includes over 1 billion doses for lower-income countries like India, where a deadly COVID surge is killing 10,000 people daily. Early phase 3 trial results from Novavax vaccine from the UK in March put it on par with vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna. The company is preparing to file for US authorizations in a matter of weeks. 31% of 1 billion vaccine doses administered worldwide so far have gone to North America. A little under 2% have gone to Africa. Zahid Qureshi may be on the way to becoming the first Muslim federal judge in America, but not without controversy. US President Joe Biden announced in March that he would nominate the New Jersey magistrate judge to join the United States District Court for New Jersey. This was part of an effort to diversify the federal judiciary. Although Qureshi has been endorsed by a number of state legal groups, some American Muslims are questioning the nomination. They say his past work as a lawyer for the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, as well as his service in the military during the Iraq War as a detention advisor while deployed, makes him a questionable choice. Qureshi was born in New York and graduated from Rutgers Law School, Newark, in 2000. He joined the Army in 2003, where he became a captain in the U.S. Army Judge Advocates General's Corps. Lawyers and advocates critical of his nomination said the selection process did not include major Muslim advocacy groups. This includes Council on American Islamic Relations, the country's largest Muslim civil rights organization. Critics claim that 20 to 50 other Muslims in the legal field would have been a better choice, and that specific Muslim groups that are major Democratic donors but have no experience in human rights work or in choosing judges were given priority in suggesting Qureshi as a nominee. In international news, as India continues to face a devastating surge in COVID, neighboring Pakistan may face a shortage of oxygen gas for respiratory illnesses like the virus. Although the bulk of the life-saving gas is currently being used for the treatment of Pakistan's COVID patient, it continues to be supplied for the industrial sector. Munib Khan Babar of Multan Chemical Limited, one of the 5 companies in the country that produces oxygen gas, said that the oxygen producing sector was under stress due to the COVID pandemic. Babar said that Pakistan could meet the domestic need for oxygen gas if all plants work at maximum capacity with support from the government. He also said the use of oxygen gas needed to be diverted from the industrial sector to the health sector. There are over 4,000 COVID-19 patients on high and low oxygen throughout Pakistan, as well as on ventilators on Friday, according to the country's National Command and Operations Center data. Health officials said patients requiring oxygen were on the rise due to a surge in COVID cases and hospitalizations. American officials announced new sanctions on Burma in the wake of its violence against protesters of the country's February 1st military coup. The latest sanctions target 2 state-owned businesses with connections to the armed forces. The move is part of an escalating international effort to jolt the country back onto a democratic path. Burma has been in turmoil since its military ousted civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi in February. Hundreds and thousands have taken to the streets in protest to demand a return to democracy. Last month, 70 people died in a crackdown on protests after the ruling junta declared martial law in Yangon, its largest city. The United Nations has warned that detained protesters are facing torture and hundreds have disappeared as the death toll mounts. In a historic first for soccer's Premier League, a game was paused on Monday to allow Muslim players to eat and drink mid-game to break their Ramadan fast. Muslim soccer player Wesley Fofana tweeted his thanks to the league and to the Crystal Palace Football Club for allowing him and Shehu Kuyat to do so. Leicester and Crystal Palace had agreed with referee Graham Scott before the match that there would be a pause after half an hour into the game to allow the players to break fast. Player Bihente Waita delayed taking a goal kick to allow Fofana and Kuyat to take energy gels at the side of the pitch. Fofana was able to play the entire game after previously playing 61 minutes in a 3-1 win, all while fasting. An illegal Israeli wall divides people and Palestine into bits and pieces. It's the longest separation wall built in the last 100 years. More from Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk about this wall.
The International Court of Justice declared this wall to be illegal, and the United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly demanded its removal by a vote of 150 in agreement and 6 opposing. But the wall is still there. Israel started building this wall in 2002. They call it a separation war. Palestinians, on the other hand, call it apartheid. 85% of the wall is not in Israel but actually located within the occupied West Bank of Palestine. The 440-mile-long wall methodologically slices through Palestinian communities and their farms, with some Palestinian towns nearly encircled by this wall. The wall reduces Palestinian freedoms and also restricts access to their water. Because of the wall, thousands of Palestinian children have to go through an Israeli checkpoint every day in order to reach their school. Many other Palestinians who need medical care face life and death issues as they must switch ambulances on each side of the wall in order to reach a hospital. Palestinians believe that this wall is an Israeli mechanism to annex Palestinian territories.
Now for our special report on Ramadan tonight. It's about an essential item on the iftar table. Dates are fruits, which are deeply rooted in the Muslim diet. Fasting Muslims break their fast with a date, as the Prophet did, peace be upon him. Ali Khalaf and Saleha are back with more details about dates.
The date fruit is a very special food for Muslims all around the world. In religious holy scripture, Allah tells us that He asked Mary to eat dates before giving a miraculous birth to Jesus, peace be upon them all. The chapter of Mary in the Holy Quran says specifically to her to shake towards you the date palm tree. It will drop upon you fresh, ripe dates. Dates are not only delicious, but science also tells us that the dates are one of the best known nutritious fruits. Dates contain several vitamins and minerals, and they are high in calories since they are a dry fruit. Including dates in your diet is a great way to increase your fiber intake. Dates also contain several types of antioxidants that may help prevent the development of certain chronic illnesses. There are hundreds of varieties and sizes of dates, and an average sized date could be around 50 calories.
Ali and Saleha, thank you for those informative reports. Coming up next after the break, our in-depth analysis segment. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after these messages.
So it's nothing extraordinary what we do. It's just a human to human, like brothers to brothers and sisters to sisters. Nothing else, nothing more.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Friends, our world is pulling together like never before. We're making huge sacrifices to keep one another safe. Scientists are working non-stop to develop COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. A vaccine will get our economies moving. It will tell our loved ones we're safe again. But we have challenges we must address. Right now, Huge pharmaceutical companies are keeping the vaccine research a secret. They're deciding how many vaccines get made, how much to charge for them, and who gets vaccinated. This will no doubt leave billions of people behind. Pharma companies are putting profit, not people, first. Yet, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is funding their work. We cannot let the CEOs of a handful of pharmaceutical companies decide our future. We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us. To end this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to pull together once more.
Welcome back. The Human Rights Watch report describing Israeli crimes of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians needs more discussion. To discuss these specific crimes in details, let's go to Saliha Farouk. Over to you, Saliha.
Thank you, Hena. Today, we're honored to speak with John Quigley, who is a professor emeritus of international law at Ohio State University, and he's also a writer. He's authored several different books, a couple of which we'd like to mention today that include The Statehood of Palestine, International Law in the Middle East Conflict, and The International Diplomacy of Israel's Founders, Deception at the United Nations in the Quest for Palestine. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Professor John.
Thank you.
Now, interestingly, in this almost 500-page report or so by Human Rights Watch, they defined this idea or this concept of apartheid and persecution under international conventions, of course, including under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. We would imagine that every definition of atrocity crimes would be determined differently, of course, based on where those crimes are being committed. Now, in your opinion, how is the concept of apartheid considered when applied to the Palestinian people?
Well, as applied to the Palestinian people, it means a separation by a dominant group over a group that it is able to extend its control over. That's how the Apartheid Convention was originally conceived on the model of South Africa. And the idea that Human Rights Watch is putting forth, which I think is quite plausible, is that idea, that concept, that violation applies as well to Palestine. In fact, one might say it applies even more strongly in Palestine than it did in South Africa. In South Africa, the dominant group forced the other group to live only in certain areas of the country and kept them from any participation in the governing structure of the country. With respect to Israel, what was done, in my mind, is worse, namely that the dominant group forced the population out of the country. They didn't even let them stay in the country. In South Africa, that was never done. The government of South Africa didn't try to force the African population out of the territory of South Africa. So to that extent, I think Human Rights Watch is on the right track.
Thank you so much. That is quite fascinating. And I do appreciate you bringing up the parallels with the apartheid movement in South Africa, of course. The report, as we know, that was recently released by Human Rights Watch, detailed a number of different methods and actions taking place towards the Palestinian people that do suggest a probable sense of structural oppression. Now, in what parts of Palestine and Israel is this structural oppression occurring? If you could let us know. And is there apartheid when it comes to the housing, for example, of Jews versus Palestinians? And can you perhaps touch upon the various forms of discrimination that might be occurring in this region, perhaps the modern day atrocity crimes that we should know about today in Palestine and Israel?
Well, one can talk about the different sectors of Palestine. You have the sectors that were occupied by Israel in 1967, the Gaza area and the West Bank area. Then you have the sectors that were taken by the Zionist militias in 1948. So you can talk about those areas separately with regard to these matters. With regard to the area that was taken in 1948, one has a very remarkable statute that was adopted by the Knesset, the Parliament of Israel, in 2018, called the Basic Law on the Nation State of the Jewish People. And that law says that Israel exists for the Jewish people, and that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in that territory, and that they are the only people that have a right to self-determination in that territory. So that means that the indigenous population is considered to be outside the political framework of the country. That is quite a remarkable posture for the government to take, and to my mind is a reflection of apartheid.
Okay. Thank you for that. I wanted to follow up by asking that, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, unfortunately, the entire topic and the events around the region doesn't ever faze us with any new revelations or new facts. However, in light of this recent report released by Human Rights Watch that we're discussing today, how are such studies, whether it's Human Rights Watch study or any kind of similar study, how are such studies being used to reframe this age-old conversation? If you can talk us through how human rights defenders are advocating against crimes against humanity in Palestine today versus the long-running discourse that we might be used to seeing in the news.
Well, I think the new element here, and this is something the Human Rights Watch report mentions, is that we now have an international criminal court, which can prosecute persons for crimes against humanity, for genocide, for war crimes. And that is being suggested now by Human Rights Watch as an avenue to deal with this, so that, as you say, there's been criticism for many years, but now there's a possibility of some action in an international court, and the international criminal court has in fact begun a process of analyzing some of these issues, not entirely the ones that Human Rights Watch would like to see there, but some issues that would constitute war crimes on the part of officials of the Israeli government. Now, that was initiated a few years ago by the International Criminal Court, and just recently the proceedings in the court have progressed to the point that the prosecutor is now examining the question of what possible crimes might be charged against different officials, and in particular against officials of the Israeli government. And in particular, the statute of the International Criminal Court makes it a crime to transfer civilians into territory under belligerent occupation, meaning to transfer them for purposes of residence and settlement. And that means that promoting the settlements that exist today in the West Bank area of Palestine, promoting those settlements is defined as a war crime. And that is now being investigated by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court with a view to identifying particular persons, and these would be officials, who are responsible for the commission of that war crime.
That's quite fascinating, and I do appreciate you going into different conventions of international law and how that might apply to the situation today. Now, of course, when this report was released, we definitely weren't surprised to find a number of criticisms coming from the Israeli government. If you could just talk to us also just from a research and policy perspective, to what extent do such groundbreaking, let's say, reports have on making a change from that policy perspective? At what point does international law become applicable when such reports with such detailed evidence becomes public from such institutions like Human Rights Watch?
Well, reports like this can have a significant impact. The International Criminal Court, for example, looks to different sources of information on the allegations that are made before it. And so this report will be given serious consideration, I think, by the International Criminal Court. The judges, of course, have to figure out for themselves what crimes are committed. But when there is a prestigious institution like Human Rights Watch coming out with a very detailed report, that influences in two ways. One, there is a kind of acceptance that this is significant. The other is that Human Rights Watch will refer to details, and those details can be followed up by the International Criminal Court.
Okay, wonderful. I wanted to follow up by getting your thoughts on how today we're seeing quite an interesting shift in human rights lens, and in a way that focuses away from the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza's blockade to perhaps questioning Israel's commitment to democracy and civil rights, even within its own borders. And I know that you spoke to a little bit about this during our conversation today, but what does signify for the international community stepping in? Do you believe there is hope for recognition of the crimes being advanced here against Israel?
Yeah, I think the report does focus the attention of the international community on the situation, not only in the territories that Israel occupied in 1967, but in the territories that the state of Israel was able to take in 1948. And there one does find significant elements that qualify as apartheid. I mean, the landholding system in Israel, for example, is such that most of the land, something like 93% of the land, is held by institutions that require that the land be used by Jews, so that most of the land of Palestine that became Israeli in 1948 is excluded from ownership by the Arab population. Of course, most of them were forced out, and the areas out of which they were forced now, the land is taken over, and therefore it is not accessible to the Arab population. Even worse, at the time when the Arab population was expelled, the government of Israel went to Barclays Bank and demanded that Barclays Bank turn over the accounts of the Arabs who were expelled. And Barclays Bank, unfortunately, complied with that request and turned that money over. So not only were the Arabs forced out of their country, but their bank accounts were taken. So even when they were, in exile somewhere, they couldn't go to Barclays Bank and say, "Please give us the money from our checking accounts." And they even went to court over that in England, and the case went up to the House of Lords, which said that Barclays Bank had committed no wrong by doing that. A very unfortunate decision in the House of Lords. So the population of Palestine, the Arab population, was not only removed from the country, but they were impoverished by the government of Israel.
Thank you so much for that. And here's to hoping for a resolve in the humanitarian situation in the region right now. Professor John Quigley of Ohio State University, we are quite fortunate to have this insightful conversation with you here today. Thank you so much for being here with us again, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you, Saleha. Before moving on to our next in-depth analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid, walking up and down the world's largest refugee camps. I met Sister Fatima. Well, I'm calling her a sister. She was just a teenage girl, my granddaughter's age. Her parents were slaughtered by the Burmese military, and she was dragged by the Burmese soldiers to their hut, and all night long she was violated. She lost consciousness. When she regained, and in the morning and soldiers were themselves away, she ran and hid in a vegetable patch. Some people saw her, gave her clothes, and took her 4-day-long walk to Bangladesh. Who will speak up for her? Who will stand up for her if not you and I? It's our responsibility. It's our duty, brothers and sisters in humanity. And that's why I like you to support Burma Task Force. I'm a volunteer for it. But Burma Task Force is standing up to stop this genocide, violation of our sisters. You and I are free, they are not. Please stand up, work with Burma Task Force, and donate today to Burma Task Force. Together, we can do it. Assalamu alaikum.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. President Biden's America's Family Plan is announced, but this plan does not include an expansion of Medicare eligibility or a provision allowing the program to negotiate prices directly with drug companies. To discuss this in detail, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. In his first joint address to the US Congress, President Biden cared to mention that Americans pay 3 times the price for prescription drugs as other Western countries. And drugs and health was in his mind. He mentioned it 14 times in his address. Does that mention counts as emphasis, or is there a real thing in there? Will he succeed in doing something President Trump says he is trying to do, that is lowering the drug prices? What can be done all about that? To discuss these things with us is Margarita George, who is Executive Director of Healthcare for America Now. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So President asked Congress for $200 billion for expanding Obamacare subsidiaries, $225 billion for paid medical leaves, and he wants NIH, a new agency, to develop breakthrough medicines to prevent, detect, and cure Alzheimer, diabetes, and other diseases. With all of that, do you think you're going to get all that money?
He's got a very ambitious tax plan. So everything that he's proposing in the Americans Family Plan is actually paid for. There's no deficit spending. So I think it's helpful to look at the plan, both in terms of what he's proposing on the investment side, as you're saying, making permanent improvements in affordability in the Affordable Care Act, research for NIH, and then to look over on the revenue side, which is a series of tax measures that would increase taxes on the rich, mainly people making over $400,000 a year, and corporations, and that's going to finance this bill, which in a lot of cases, these are 10-year programs, and sometimes they're permanent improvements. So yeah, I think he can do it. I think the tax provisions in the measure are very, very popular. He's certainly better positioned to do it from a public opinion point of view and from an urgency point of view than any president that we've seen in recent history. So I would say I'm optimistic overall.
Okay. To say overall, what are the areas do you think he omitted from his plans?
Well, a big one, a lot of us were expecting to see, and the president did talk about this last night. He actually talked about it more than we thought. The president, talked about negotiations and lowering drug prices. So if he had included that in the bill, which many of us thought he would, but ultimately he did not include it in the proposal. But that would have been a really significant way to pay for a lot of those healthcare expenditures, because including negotiations in Medicare would save about $500 billion over 10 years. So that could pay for the ACA subsidies twice, right? It could pay 2 times over. It could pay for expansions in Medicare, like, for instance, providing dental, oral, vision care to seniors in Medicare, which they currently don't have. So that, I think, was an omission. And then the other big omission that I saw, and I was a little bit surprised about this one, was there was nothing specific in his speech or in the proposal about eliminating the coverage gap. And so we have in the United States, 3 to 4 million people that have no access to health care. And they don't have access to health care because they live in states where their legislature has refused to expand Medicaid. And so those folks have no recourse in places like Texas and Florida and Georgia, North Carolina, South Dakota. So I was expecting him to have some proposal that would allow people in states where there was political opposition to Medicaid expansion to get health care some other way, because, while we have a moment where we're actually willing to raise revenue, we're coming out of a pandemic, now would be the time to really ensure that every single person in this country could have access to affordable health care.
Margarita, you mentioned that his bill does not include letting Medicare negotiate for the prescription drugs.
Mm-hmm.
But then why did he mention in his speech, he says letting Medicare negotiate?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, in the written plan that the president had put out in the American Family Plan, he also mentions it in writing and says, I'm very committed to this. And of course, he ran on it. And so it has been puzzling as to why it didn't actually end up as one of the policy proposals. I think there's a couple of reasons. One is there's just some things that I think the president wants Congress to do. So I think the president's position on Medicare negotiations, because there's a tremendous lobby that's going to try to stop negotiations, his position is to say to Congress, look, members of the House and the Senate, if you all bring me a bill that is a Medicare negotiations bill, I'll sign that bill, right? So I think he is measuring sort of what are the fights that he's already going to have in the existing proposals, and some of those things are going to be delegated to Congress. I also think that there's a fair amount of skepticism that we can get enough Democrats in the Senate to support Medicare negotiations. And the challenge then of putting Medicare negotiations in a very large omnibus bill like what the president is proposing in the American Families Act is that if you have senators that don't support negotiations, that one provision could then sink the entire bill. And I think that he doesn't want to take that risk.
President Trump also said, I'm getting a lot of heat for trying to lower drug prices. What was his model, and do Republicans care for reducing the drug prices?
I think Republicans do care about it because it's an incredibly popular issue. So even the majority drug negotiations in Medicare polls very well across Republicans and Democrats, very, very well. Over 80% of Republicans think that we should have negotiated drug prices. So I think they care because they understand that their electorate tends to be older. That tends to be the population of people who use prescription drugs. And it is actually a hardship for their folks. And so I think we've started to hear more and more from Republicans who are saying, we do agree that something needs to be done. Most often, the Republicans, when they're saying something needs to be done about drug prices, are not referring to negotiations. They are referring to transparency or a cost cap. And, those types of things are pretty minor and aren't going to address the underlying problem. So I do think that there are Republicans that care about this issue. And in fact, over the last 2 years, we've seen a bipartisan bill in the Senate, Senator Grassley and Senator Wyden, on prescription drug prices. It didn't include negotiations, but it had some other okay features in it.
But in the world where there's a big divide, do you think that popular support from the Republican base is going to somehow translate in swinging some vote in favor of overall plan?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why Democrats and Republicans are both going to talk about this issue and why they've been talking about it. And remember that when President Trump got elected in 2016, he actually ran on negotiations, right? So he was the first Republican that actually ran in support of making Medicare negotiate prices. And he was quoted, right? His quote was, "I'm going to make Medicare negotiate like crazy." Subsequently, he backed away from that position. But I think one of the things that's motivating this movement around lowering drug prices is, as you know, we have a midterm election coming up in 2022. It's just less than 2 years away. The electorate in the midterm election is a disproportionately older electorate, right? So it is a third seniors. And this issue is very, very hot across the board, but it's very, very, very hot with seniors. And I think there is a lot of concern that the Democrats are going to lose a chamber. And if that happens, we'll be in political gridlock. So I think a lot of, Speaker Pelosi, who last week reintroduced the Lower Drug Costs Act, which is HR 3 to lower drug prices. I think there's a lot of political concern that if Democrats don't do something to lower drug prices, and a thing that is actually discernible to people when they go pick up their prescriptions, they're going to have a very difficult time retaining their majority, particularly on the House side in 2022.
Are there some Republicans who think if they don't support this move, there is a risk for them not able to gain victory in 22 elections?
I think there will be Republicans that aggressively run on this issue for sure, and we've seen lots of Republicans campaigning on it over the last few years, including both Trump and members of the House and the Senate. And so I think Senator Johnson in Wisconsin talks about drugs, Senator Toomey in Pennsylvania, and you'll notice a pattern. It tends to be the senators that represent states with older populations. I'm certain you're going to hear the senators in Florida talking about this issue. So, senators on both sides, representatives on both sides are going to talk about the issue, and they're going to say largely very similar things, but the policies that they propose and support will be different.
Okay, so why eligibility age for Medicare got left out also?
I think, the president has been on the record supporting a lower Medicare eligibility age. And I think the reason he didn't specify, and he just said generally that he is looking to make expansions, he's looking to expand and strengthen Medicare, is because there's a debate among Democrats about how the savings from prescription drug reform should be spent. So prescription drug reform, HR 3, would generate $456 billion in savings, and there's multiple things that we could do with those savings. Speaker Pelosi is saying what we should do is we should expand, we should pay for the ACA subsidies so that people can have permanently more affordable health care. We should add vision, dental, and hearing in Medicare. Senator Sanders is saying we should add, vision, dental, hearing in Medicare and lower the eligibility age for Medicare. So I think there's not agreement essentially on how to divide up the spoils. What do we do with the savings? And so I think, Biden is not he actually supports all of those things. He supports the full range of those things plus more things. But I think he's not taking a position, and that signals to members of the House and Senate that they should work that out amongst themselves, right? That, once the key thing is passing the legislation, how we spend that money, what investments result from it, the members of Congress are going to have to work out amongst themselves.
Do you think, taking the whole plan, he has almost $4 trillion plan for the whole country. Mm-hmm. Do you think with everything made announcements and things like that, the healthcare cost, which has been a major issue, do you think the bottom line will be that healthcare cost will go down, or you don't see that happening with what is announced already?
It's hard to say. I think there's two ways to look at it. And the way that I look at it that I think is the most important is, to me, what matters is, are healthcare costs going down for regular people? That is, are people seeing lower premiums and are people seeing more affordable medicines at the pharmacy so that they can go to the pharmacy, pick up their insulin, and they don't have to leave it at the counter because it's $100 more expensive than they thought. So I think, yes, that will happen for sure. But I think in terms of the bigger picture, macroeconomic questions about the cost of healthcare and whether or not the overall cost of healthcare, that is things like hospitalization, physician payments, all those things, is that going to be reduced? It's difficult to say. I mean, the problem, in my mind is that we're in a for-profit system, right? And so I think in a for-profit system, the system always finds a way to drive profit, which increase costs for everybody. So my view on that is that the president actually needs to do, and Congress needs to do 2 or 3 different things, not just one thing. That problem isn't going to get solved by just one thing. The other thing is the provisions in the American Families Plan that are not ostensibly healthcare provisions, things like paid family medical leave, things like better nutrition, over time actually do reduce healthcare costs because we spend more money on healthcare than any other nation. Our health outcomes are not as good. It's not because our healthcare is not as good. It's because the social determinants of health in this country are vastly different than other countries, right? So, even just the fact that people in this country can't take medical leave, even during a pandemic, they can't take medical leave, does impact health outcomes. So I think when you're thinking about cost and how to reduce overall cost, there's got to be multiple approaches to the problem. It's a long-term problem. In the short term, what we can do in the next 2 years is we can make sure that people who are going to the pharmacy are not having to pay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for medicines like insulin that have been around for 100 years.
You were among the earliest people who welcomed the appointment of the first Latino Secretary of Health and Human Services. There is a policy which Congress passed, there are executive orders. What a Secretary of Health can do by herself or himself to improve the situation? Does he have any choices?
I think he's got choices. The HHS Secretary Becerra, who we are big fans of, and we think that it's incredibly important to have people in leadership roles driving healthcare policies that care about health equity, because that's an essential. When you look at the United States and things like maternal mortality, where Black women are dying at 2, 3 times the rate of white women in childbirth, like that definitely needs to be addressed. So. I think the secretary can do a number of things within his purview that essentially don't have budgetary impact. But among those things are things like they can trigger march-in rights, right? So march-in rights are an obscure provision of the law that would enable the U.S. government to break patents. Right, so the Moderna vaccine, right? The Moderna vaccine is co-owned by the U.S. government and Moderna, entirely funded by public money. Moderna actually has no other medicines on the market. That is the only medicine that they have. If they decided that they wanted to next year raise the price by 50%, which sometimes prescription drug companies do that, the secretary could intervene and stop them. Right, so there's really important regulatory, power that the secretary has. The secretary also has power to redirect resources. He has the power to sue states that do things that that limit healthcare access. He has the power to reverse a lot of the Trump era damage to things like discrimination under the healthcare law. Right, under Obamacare, there's a provision that healthcare providers actually cannot discriminate against people of color, trans people, LGBTQ people. Trump reversed it. HHS Secretary Becerra is going to bring it back. So there's many things like that the secretary can do. We know this secretary has litigated a lot against insurance companies, hospitals, and prescription drug companies that leverage monopoly power to jack up prices. And so what I really hope we see is that he's going to intervene when we see the consolidation of drug companies. Consolidation of drug companies reduces innovation, takes us further and further away from getting to the cures that we want, and also enables them to have more power to bring up prices. So there's a number of different ways that the secretary can intervene.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Margarita, for your time. I appreciate it. Back to you, Hena.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid, for that discussion. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Keep watching Muslim Network TV. For more, visit our website, muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.
Special thanks to our official supporter, Zagat Foundation of America.